You may remember that we once talked about a really, really tiny Tyrannosaurus skeleton. The person who sent that to us, Herb, actually took our advice and made a more modernized Tyrannosaurus, and has been in communication with us more recently because we are working on our proper Velociraptor episode, and he happens to have made a Velociraptor skeleton at the, well, it's at a much different scale than the Tyrannosaurus was, because it's about the same size that the Tyrannosaurus would have been. But if you recall, before we shot the episode about the Tyrannosaurus skeleton, I managed to sweep it off the table and run it over with my chair. But that didn't happen with this guy because it comes with, first off, this really rather lovely box. But it comes with this glass dome, which prevents me from damaging it between assembling it and shooting the episode. It is glass though, so I should put this somewhere where I won't break it. Now, I actually assembled this today. It was a harrowing process. The instructions online suggested 30 to 45 minutes. It took me about twice that. I kept breathing, which it turns out is a bad thing to do if you have a bunch of little tiny parts. And I just had a lot of difficulty with actually grasping them, even though this kit conveniently does come with tweezers and glue. Glue is actually required for this model to stand up. It doesn't have the tripodal standing on its tail stance that the Tyrannosaurus did, which I like. Velociraptor in particular, you almost never see in a tripod stance, but you will often see the tip of the tail being used as a crutch in sort of an artful tripod, or using the hallux, the reversed first toe, or mostly reversed first toe, as sort of a crutch, the way that a bird might stand on it. Or you'll see really clever stuff like the fingers of the hand, just the fingertips, are forming a third strut for the animal to stand on. So that there are ways around that, but in this case, we just glued it to a piece of wood. My general impression of the model is that this is about the best that you could do using this material at this scale to communicate Velociraptor. I have nitpicks, of course. We wouldn't have an episode if I didn't have nitpicks, but I recognize rather clearly, having fiddled around putting it together, that there are limitations on how small certain parts can get and how detailed certain parts can get when you're making a 2-inch long Velociraptor. I do like that, unlike a lot of skeleton kits you'll see at any scale, Herb put in the effort to have an epistopubic hip, which is the pubis bone, unlike in other Saurischian dinosaurs, is reversed, as opposed to pointing forward. Both the hip bones and the tail bones have implications for how the animal holds itself and walks. Dromaeosaurs were not balanced at the hip. They didn't walk from the hip so much as their theropod ancestors did, but they were not the fully, only the knee really moves gait that birds have. They were somewhat intermediate. But they were not holding their bodies up above parallel the way that you see in birds. They were still very much holding their spines roughly parallel to the ground. So it's good that that is present. Another thing I like, which I can't actually demonstrate at the moment, is that the site that this comes from, Everything Tiny, has online instructions where it's a 3D model that you can scroll through, and it has little pop-ups that show such and such item is not actually a bone that's on Velociraptor. It's actually just a structural element that we had to include, like this strut, where you would expect, the keel, the breastbone. Well, it's not exactly a bone. The sternal plate and the coracoids to be. They actually just have this strut running over to the scapula and the base of the humor. They don't actually have coracoids represented. The pectoral girdle is probably a bit wide overall, but they do have I noticed that they include an alternate set of arms. If I could grab it. This is what I've been struggling with for the last 2 hours. They include... I can do this. More Jurassic Park-y arms, where they have their hands pronated down and curled around, although, as you can see, it's still just the whole hand is one piece. In case whoever buys this is a heretic and is okay with throwing out science in favor of what looks scarier. But the default hands that come on the main sheet that you get are the proper hands. And they even, although the hands are slightly oversized, as is the head, presumably so that they could show this detail, like I actually bothered to show the individual finger bones. I don't know if you can tell, but the hands are quite good. The claws would be curving inwards, so if you're going to present it just in lateral view like this, you wouldn't see the curves, and they didn't feel the need to cheat to show them. The proportions of the fingers are correct. The first finger is shortest, and the third finger is only slightly shorter than the second. You'll often see Velociraptor with just 3 pretty short Allosaurus-like fingers. Not the case here. The funny bone, the humerus, the upper arm bone, is a bit short. That should be longer than the forearm. But overall, the angle that the arms are at, which admittedly is probably, well, I can look at the box art. No, I have it about right, where they're supposed to be, which is within the range of motion of what a Velociraptor would be holding its arms at. Their arms could elevate to sub-horizontal based on the shoulder socket orientation. Another thing that's absent, probably because it would be too small to turn out or too small to punch out of the little card, the uncinate processes on the ribs, those barbs that are on ribs, I want to say 3 through 6, are not present, which were anchor points for muscles for helping the creature breathe and helping the shoulder work better. As I mentioned, there's no sternal plate. The belly ribs are absent. That's actually noted in the online instructions that they had to leave the gastralia out. I don't know. They almost could have, but it would have been very abstract. They could have added it as like a single element parallel to the spine, just make the whole spine part a loop. And you could have done the gastralia that way. I understand not doing that, though. Overall, my 2 biggest gripes with this model are that the tail is entirely too short. Velociraptor's tail should be even longer than the rest of the animal put together. Even before feathers is why I had to think about that. This one is I don't know, it should be far longer than it is. And I recognize why it couldn't be longer, because if they wanted it to fit inside the glass dome without being either extremely tiny to accommodate that tail, if you scaled the whole thing down by 50%, you could probably have the tail the proper length proportional, but then you'd have all these incredibly tiny pieces to work with. Or you could maybe do something with the tail like curved around, but that might be, that would present its own difficulties with assembly. Yeah, the other main gripe I have is that much of the skeleton is just too wide. If you look here, the hip is extremely wide. The hip on Velociraptor should really be only slightly wider than the skull. Now, mind you, I don't know that it would be possible to make a hip that narrow, because as you can see, he put in the effort to have a pair of ischia and pubes underneath the animal there. So if you wanted to cheat and just have one piece of paper there, you could probably do it. But if you're committed to having all of the bones represented in the hip, there's a minimum width that has to be when you're at this scale. The neck is far too wide. They could have gotten away with not having those little cross pieces that were a pain to put in. Similarly, on the tail, the cross pieces should be significantly narrower. They should be about the width of the head, about the width of the hip when they start off, and they should taper off much faster. Only the first, I want to say 6 vertebrae on Velociraptor would have had really pronounced transverse processes, is what those are called, because the tail transitions from having a very flexible portion right near the base of the tail to having the famous bundled rods for the rest of the length. And that has interesting functional implications that we will get into in the episode proper. But yeah, they could have just had 6 of these, and then I wouldn't have had to put so many of those little things on there and accidentally breathe on it and blow it off the table. And that was difficult, and it could have been avoided if you just wanted to make a slightly more accurate dinosaur. I recognize that it's probably so that people feel like they have something to do. There's also there's not quite enough neck, and I don't think there are enough ribs. Velociraptor had, I believe, 11 ribs, and this one has 8. I mentioned the head being a little bit large, and I speculate that it's to account for detail. The wrongness can be attributed to that, though. The fenestrae should be larger. The openings for the eye sockets, for the anteorbital fenestra, and for the nose should be bigger, but if they were bigger, then you'd have way less material up top to hold the piece of paper together, so it would probably just rip. The teeth are obviously oversized. The whole skull is a little bit robust. Velociraptor has extremely depressed nasals. The bone on the top of the snout is concave in profile view. And in dorsal view, Velociraptor had a very narrow snout, which then widened into the cranium area of the head, which I'm not really sure how they could represent that at this scale. Once again, they probably could have had, one piece of paper for the center of the snout, and then 3 at the base. But then you're not going to have 2 tooth rows, and they clearly wanted to have 2 tooth rows. The teeth do extend probably too far back into the mouth. They should stop about where the anteorbital fenestra leaves off. And the jawbone, the jawbone is a bit lantern-jawed. The back of it is just a little too squared off there. Oh, and I neglected to mention the chevrons on the bottom of the tail as well leave off. They're still present further past the 6th caudal vertebrae, but they get very short and difficult to see under the rods, whereas these, they're always a bit too long, again, probably because of the scale, but those could leave off much earlier. The legs, I don't have a lot of complaints about. You might look at these and say, hey, these feet are really short. Well, Velociraptor did have really short feet. The second toe, you can kind of see that the claw is there. I think they could have done more to elevate that, or extend it. I wanted to say retract, because it is key. They did hold their second toe off the ground so that the claw would stay sharp. But the actual action of doing so is called extending. But the other 2 toes, I have no complaints about. The third toe is about right. The 4th toe is maybe a bit long, but I'll take it. You'll notice that it's standing slightly pigeon-toed. I'm not sure if that's my fault. I may have assembled it slightly poorly. Let's turn to the box art. It's a little difficult to tell from the box art, too. I think I'm not too far off, in which case it is walking with its 3rd and 4th toes pointing outwards, whereas really they should be, at the very least, the 3rd toe should be parallel to the direction that the animal is standing. But this isn't an impossible pose for Velociraptor to hold. There's nothing, they didn't have to dislocate anything to get it to stand like this. So even with all of those complaints, I have to stress that I get the impression Herb is trying to represent Velociraptor as it was, within the constraints of making a tiny little fiddly paper and glue model. I noticed on the site that this is listed as a medium difficulty model for everything tiny, for Tinosaurus. Never send me a hard one, Herb, because I think it will physically harm me to try to put it together. This thing, it's the size of my thumb, first off, and I am not cut out for assembling these. But if this is the kind of thing that appeals to you, you can follow the affiliate link in our description and buy one, and a portion of your purchase will come back to support the show. In any case, thank you for watching Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong, and we will see you next time.